This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the USEA Power Sector Podcast series on utility planning, Arne Olson, senior partner with consultant Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3, is going to describe how variable and customer-owned energy resources, rising demand, and new policies are driving the need to move beyond siloed resource and distribution system planning to the new concept of integrated system planning, which would optimize the use of all available resources. Arne's helped lead E3's work on system planning and resource integration for 23 years. Before that, he was a senior energy policy specialist with the Washington State Department of Commerce and began his now 32-year career as a consultant with the Decision Analysis Corporation in 1993. Arne, traditional utility planning processes seem just inadequate to address the major changes on today's power system. Before we get into planning innovations, what timeframes does typical utility planning address? And why is this shift in planning needed? What's the overall goal of planning?
Yeah, thank you, Herman. I'll just start off by thanking you for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here to talk about integrated system planning. To answer your question, the industry is undergoing enormous change in this country and really everywhere. The challenges that it's addressing, the problems that it's being asked to solve are really a step change above anything that the industry has dealt with over the past, 20 or even more years. The amount of investment that's going to be required in the sector is just enormous, in the trillions of dollars. There's a variety of reasons for that. Transforming the bulk system from a system that has been dependent on fossil generation, carbon emitting resources to clean resources. So from coal to, a system that's dominated by wind, solar, batteries, and natural gas. That's going to involve transmission, the need to invest in bulk transmission to integrate these remote resources, but also to serve growing loads. We have, new loads at a scale we haven't seen before in generations to reflect, the new needs for data centers, artificial intelligence. We have onshoring of industrial load, battery manufacturers, a variety of manufacturers that are, siting onshore. We have exciting new consumer technologies like electric vehicles that are really a game changer in terms of how much demand you might draw at your house. We're starting to layer on top of that electric heat pumps, both for policy-driven reasons, but also because they're good technologies that people are increasingly using. And to add to that, we have just more extreme weather. Seems like the weather is outgrowing the sizing of our existing grids. So we now have continental scale weather events in a way that we haven't seen before. We have heat domes, we have polar vortices, we have fires, we have flooding, just all kinds of things that are happening that are requiring investment, layering on top of rebuilding all of the infrastructure that's aging. It's been in place maybe since the 1950s or even before. So just a huge amount of investment that's required. The timeline of the investments varies depending on the nature of them. Bulk transmission is maybe 50 years or longer. Generation might be 20 to 40 years. On the customer side, it might be a shorter time frame. That's one of the challenges of doing the integrated planning. But really, the main motivation of it is there's so much investment that's required. It's going to be incumbent on the industry to make that investment wisely. Affordability is already a challenge in a lot of places. Particularly in California, where I live. And so utilities that want to make these capital investments, which are good for their bottom line, are going to need to convince themselves, their boards of directors, their regulators, that they're making the investments wisely. They're getting the most out of existing facilities before they go to invest in new ones. They're making the right investments at the right time in the right place and really avoiding duplicative investments. And so that really is the motivator for doing more integrated system planning.
That's the paper uses that phrase, the right investments at the right time, at the right place. It's really hard to do that in the face of so much change, and a lot of that change is completely uncertain. We don't know how many heat pumps, how many electric vehicles, uh, what the extreme weather is going to be. The new E3 paper proposes integrated system planning, ISP is the acronym, to unify in a rational way today's integrated resource planning and integrated distribution system planning. Is ISP the right or even the ultimate planning approach to address costs, inefficiencies, and what are the benefits that come from ISP?
Yeah, I think it is an important concept for people to have in mind as they're doing planning of this large infrastructure. And there's a variety of reasons why our planning needs to become more integrated than it's been in the past. A big one is that the systems that we have are just becoming more interdependent.
Mm.
For the last 20 years, whenever we wanted to build generation, you just, figure out where the best place to put a gas plant is. And then you build the pipes to bring the energy to the gas plant, and the gas plant produces electricity at the right place. You haven't had to worry too much about building bulk transmission to bring generation to load. That's really changing now as we integrate larger and larger amounts of renewables like wind in particular, and geothermal, and to some extent solar. Those resources only exist in certain places. And so it's incumbent on us to build the transmission out to those generation sites. So we need to really consider both the transmission and the generation needs together as we're planning our bulk generation investments. Then there's batteries, which can defer the need for transmission if they're located at the load center, or perhaps even if they're located with the generation, because they can collect solar and deliver it after the sun goes down and reduce the need for bulk transmission out to those areas. So we really need to think of those different planning aspects together to get the most value out of the investments that we're making. It's also true on the customer side that there are just increasing, again, loads that will be located at the customer side, but also increasing ability to utilize both the loads and resources at the customer side for the benefit of the bulk system. So you can imagine electric vehicles are potentially a huge draw on the electric system, more than what your house would be, potentially by multiples if you have a level 2 charger. So whenever it's drawing a lot of power and potentially really straining the distribution grid and all the way up to the transmission and generation. But if you can manage that charging and even it out across the day or across the week, then you can really reduce the strain on the distribution system. And if you could reverse the flow and bring power from the vehicle batteries back onto the grid, you might even be able to alleviate challenges that are created by other people's behavior. So the potential to utilize those resources is much larger than it's ever been in the past. Some customers are adopting just standalone battery storage on their own to have that as a backup. And there's increasing automation of consumer devices so that all this response can be potentially automated. So you might not even notice it. You might just program your car. I want it to be full by 7 a.m. so I can drive it to work. And then the computers can all figure out when the right time is to do the charging and discharging throughout the evening, as long as it reaches a certain point by the time that you set it to. There may be, imperceptible changes to your lighting or your thermostats that could all be handled in an automated way. So just the capability of doing this at the customer level is much greater than it's ever been in the past. And we need to take note of those capabilities and make sure that we're using them to reduce our need for the infrastructure at the distribution, transmission, and generation level.
And so good comprehensive planning can sort of use all of the positives in what you just described so well, and sort of eliminate a lot of the negatives. Like for instance, there's ways to forecast how many times an EV owner might, you know, in the abstract, might need to use charging and put that heavy draw on the system, and how many times they might not. And then planning uses very sophisticated probability models to allow the utility to know what it's going to need to address all that. Now, key challenge that comes with all this change is breaking down planning silos between, as you described very well, generation, transmission, distribution, and customer-focused resources. If you do it well, you can integrate data, processes, and forecasting models. But why is breaking down silos a big challenge? And are there other big challenges like breaking down silos that this kind of comprehensive planning process will face?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge really is that these planning processes today are done by different people in different departments, with different investment goals in mind that in the past have really not had to be integrated. And I think distribution is maybe the best example of that is, if you're planning out a distribution area, what you're mostly concerned about is what's being built out in this area. Is it houses? Is it large, apartment buildings? Is it commercial buildings? Are there going to be data centers? What are the loads in this local distribution planning area? Where I'm thinking about the facilities that are needed for this area, and I don't necessarily need to understand how does that all relate to the system-wide load forecast that the generation and transmission planners need. The generation side, they might be planning for 1% load growth per year. They don't necessarily know where it is or even necessarily care where it is, or they haven't in the past. And I'm here on my distribution feeder saying, I've got some of that over here. And, I don't know if it adds up to the whole thing or not, but I don't care because all I care about is making sure my little area has its needs taken care of. And I've got the investments planned because that's my job, is to make sure that I can meet the loads that are going to locate in this area. And I don't even have control as a distribution engineer over whether they locate there. People hook up their houses and I have to have the power ready for them. If it's a large customer, I might be able to tell, well, I can't hook you up for another 18 months because I got to build a bunch of facilities. That doesn't work for the smaller for houses, and for smaller customers. So I have a job that I have to do that's kind of independent of the job that everyone else has to do. And similarly, if I'm on the generation side, I have to think about generally what are all the loads that I have to meet. I don't necessarily have to care about the loads in a given area. And it certainly helps me to understand how the loads behave, and using all the probabilistic models that you described. And I have a lot of these models at my disposal. Easiest thing for me to do is just assume all the loads fixed, and I just plan the generation to meet that load. And that makes my job very simple and less complicated. But the reality is now, if I'm really trying to make it the best use of all the investments I make on the generation side, I don't want to oversize them. I want to understand, is there something I can do on the load side to, shave the peak, shift loads into less stressful times. And if I can, by doing that, I can reduce the amount of generation, battery storage, and other investments that I need to make. Then I can provide, benefits to the customer over the long term through, again, the proper sizing and just making the most out of the existing and new facilities.
If you have that overall perspective, you can make the right investment at the right place at the right time. If you
Exactly.
don't have the overall perspective, you're going to make an investment here, an investment there. You may not make an investment when you really would need, find out you might really needed it, right? That's
Yes.
what you're saying essentially, right?
Yeah. And there are a variety of other challenges, so our generation and transmission planning were separated by Order 8088, right? I mean, this was the whole idea around open access to the transmission system, is that I need to plan these things separately. And there's a code of conduct that in a way prevented information from flowing back and forth between those two different business functions. As we've begun the energy transition, and this started in California, let's say 15 years ago, where it became pretty clear as we were looking at California's early renewable portfolio standard goals that there were only a certain number of places in the state where you could build good wind. And this maybe gets to the success stories, but this is one where
Yeah.
it became clear that you needed to maybe reintegrate those, at least to some extent, in order to build out the transmission system in a way that's most optimal given the changing needs.
Yeah. Well, let me ask that question, Arnie. I want to, this is we don't have a whole lot of time left in order to keep this podcast to its limits, but I want to ask that last question. The paper highlights several good examples, success stories, if you will. Hawaiian Electric's integrated grid plan, in Arizona, Salt River Project's integrated system plan, as you mentioned just now, California's integrated generation and transmission planning processes, and Power Up in NYC in New York City. In the few minutes that we have, from among those, what would you consider the most important lessons learned, takeaways about integrated planning? Are there any concrete results that show what the most important takeaways were?
Yeah, I think the most important things to focus on first are the things that have the highest value, right? And I think, integrated system planning, I think of it as in part a description of what we're already seeing evolve in the industry, as much as it is a prescription for where we should go. So
Mm.
people are seeing the same things that we're seeing, and they're already moving in the direction of, well, gosh, if the wind is only in a certain place and I have to build transmission out to that, I ought to factor in the cost of building that transmission before I decide whether I want to build that wind farm or not. And so some of that is already happening, and but not all utilities, let's say, and when they're doing integrated resource planning, are fully considering the impact of their resources on their transmission. And so that's something that we're seeing evolve over time. That is one of the things that came out of the project that we worked on with the Salt River project, for example, which is that they began to look at something called proactive siting of
Mm.
renewable resources. So rather than just waiting for the developers to bring their projects to them and with their interconnection requests and responses to their RFP, they're starting to look at where on our transmission system is the best place for us to host solar generation facilities, and can we send that information to the market to say, if you locate here, there'll be less of a transmission burden to the utility, and that's going to factor into my criteria when I go to evaluate all of the bids. So that's one of the things that the Salt River project is doing. They're an vertically integrated utility, so they run both their generation and their transmission systems, and they can just kind of do that as part of their, resource procurement process. With the RTOs, it's maybe a little bit more complicated because they plan the transmission and they explicitly don't plan the generation. But they still can't build the transmission completely ignorant of where the generation might go. And so this is what happened in California in the 2011 kind of time period when the California PUC and the ISO got together. The PUC does the generation planning, the ISO does the transmission planning, and they developed a process that's iterative where the PUC does some generation scenarios, they pass that to the CAISO calculates the transmission investments from that, and they pass those back to the PUC, which goes back into the next resource plan. So it's informed by the transmission needs of each different resource would impose on the system. So that's I think a good example of how you can take, even when the processes are implemented by different entities, again, subject to different regulatory regimes. The CAISO is federally regulated in their transmission plan by FERC, and the PUC is state. So it's a good example of how you can bring about the spirit of integrated planning, even if it's not all under the same roof and co-optimize with the same model, et cetera.
Mm.
SRP is also, as a result of their process, identified a number of customer programs that they're looking to implement, thermostat type of program, so looking at time of use, pilots as well. The Hawaiian Electric Company is one where that's an example where they sort of also hit this fairly early on. They have a lot of distributed solar on their system. They quickly became to the point where saturation of solar from both the distribution side and the bulk side really, cuts into the value of new distributed solar on their system. And so they implemented some changes there. They're taking dispatch control over some of their solar. They're implementing storage at the
Deployment of
customer
storage.
site as well. And they really have a whole long list of initiatives that really bridge that gap between the distributed resource side and the bulk side that they've undertaken as a result of their integrated grid planning.
I got to ask you, even though we're out of time, Power Up NYC. New York City is a very different environment than the ones you just described, Arizona, Hawaii, California. What did what did Power Up NYC do for New York City? Just briefly, we're out of time, but I got to ask.
Yeah, no, and it's a good question, and it's one of the biggest reasons why it's different is because it's distribution constrained. You know, a
Mm,
lot of load concentrated in a very small geographic area. It's hard to get new wire into that area. And if you're looking at putting a bunch of new loads in Manhattan and New York City, electric vehicles and decarbonizing buildings with heat pumps, that's a lot of potential new load. And so
yeah.
that was part of what Power Up NYC was, is how much new load would that be? What are different ways that we can manage that load, either through managed charging or maybe hybrid type of heating systems, in order to make that a success rather than run up into the barrier of we just couldn't ever build out the infrastructure.
Okay, well, we got to leave it there, Arnie. Yeah, we're out of time. Thank you so much. My guest has been E3 Senior Partner Arne Olson. He's provided insights into how variable and customer-owned energy resources, rising demand, and new policies are driving the need to move beyond siloed resource and distribution system planning to the new concept of integrated system planning. Optimize the use of all available resources. Thanks so much, Arnie. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast, now available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.